Raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou, ko hara mai I ngā hau e whā ki tō mātou kāinga. Ko te tūmanako ia, kua whāowhia a koutou ki te kōrero I ngā kupu, I ngā whakaaro kua puta I ngā kai kōrero I nei rā e rua. Ko rangatira mātou I tō koutou tāinga mai ki Otaki, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. As our hui draws to a close, could I begin by saying what an absolute pleasure it has been to have had you all here in Otaki. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us as much as we have. We've been very fortunate to have had such a wonderful lineup of speakers and presenters, and also to have had such a diversity of participants at this hui. We hope that you leave here re-inspired and reinvigorated about the very important work that you all do. I tend to think of closing speeches not as finishing points, but rather as starting points. Because for me, the main reason for coming to a conference is to help us figure out what we can do better, how we can do what we do better. It's marvellous always to learn new things or to gain new insights, but the real question is, what might we do with the new knowledge that we have acquired? I approach this task knowing that I cannot hope to do justice to the breadth and the depth of material that has been covered by others who have spoken before me. So what I'm going to do is to keep it local, in the sense of speaking about what I do know, while attempting to tease out some broader themes that I think might be relevant when thinking about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and philanthropy. By now, most of you will have heard a little about Whakatupuranga Ruamano, Generation 2000. This was the 25-year plan that set out to reverse the devastating effects of colonisation on the three Indigenous nations of Te Aotearoa, Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira, collectively known as the Art Confederation. And you may be wondering about this, the photograph I have here. This is Motai Tangatarau. He's depicted on the front of the meeting house that you drive past as you go down the main street of Otaki. And this marae is regarded as a kind of a parent marae for all those three iwi nations that I've just been speaking about. You will also know that this place, Te Wānanga o Raukawa, is a product of that 25-year plan. First mooted in 1978 and established in 1981, Te Wānanga o Raukawa operated without support from the state for over a decade. It was initially very small, about 40 students I think in about 1990, and it was heavily reliant on the voluntary labour of people who believed in the cause. People, I should add, who came not only from within the Art Confederation, but from iwi nations throughout Aotearoa. It would be no exaggeration to say that the institution ran on the proverbial smell of an oily rag, but on the positive side, it was entirely free from constraint. 12 years after the proposal for this wānanga was first put forward, the Crown caught up and created a new category of tertiary education institute called a wānanga. It was a further 3 years, 1993 in fact, before Te Wānanga o Raukawa received statutory recognition as a wānanga, giving it access to Crown funding. At around this time, the decision was also made to open the doors to students from throughout Aotearoa New Zealand, and a period of rapid growth followed. By 1996, we had 600 equivalent full-time students, and by last year, this number had climbed to over 1,400. Excuse me, I have a very dry throat and I don't want to croak at you. So, while the wānanga now receives enrolments-based financial support from the Crown, its share of funding compared with other tertiary providers has always remained far from equitable. In 1999, we joined with the other two Wānanga in this country to bring a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal because the Crown had paid out something called a capital establishment grant to all other categories of tertiary education institutions except the three Wānanga. The Tribunal agreed with us that this was inequitable, but it still took a further 9 years, 2008, before we were able to actually settle this claim with the Crown. Even as we've been sitting here today, the Wānanga is preparing yet another claim to go before the Waitangi Tribunal, setting out a range of respects in which we are still being unfairly funded by the Crown within both its research funding and its tertiary funding frameworks. Despite these problems, Crown funding has enabled Te Wānanga o Raukawa to take on paid staff, to upgrade its facilities, and to increase the number of students and programs on offer. However, and this is the important bit, our experience is that financial support comes at a price. The line between state assistance and state interference is a fine one, and the Wānanga now finds itself engaged in a constant struggle to preserve the integrity of the principles upon which it was established. Any sense of liberation that one might have expected to come with Crown funding has been matched by the constraints of finding ourselves in quite a close relationship with a powerful and a historically abusive party. Now, there's nothing about our experience that is actually extraordinary here. In fact, the obstruction of potentially revolutionary Māori initiatives by Crown meddling, posing as support, has been an all too familiar phenomenon during our recent history. Other examples that could readily be cited include other Māori education initiatives, such as Te Kohanga Reo, and these are the Māori medium preschools. I think some of you went out to some site visits to visit Te Kohanga Reo yesterday. And also Kura Kaupapa Māori, and these are the Māori medium schools, years 1 to 13. Again, I think some of you may have gone to visit the Kura Kaupapa next door. There are many, many other examples of this phenomenon, but if I were to go on about them, I would be here till midnight and we still wouldn't be halfway through. So those two examples will suffice, along with Wānanga, of course. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, how is any of this connected to an international Funders for Indigenous Peoples gathering? The connection, I think, is this. Having learned through bitter experience that reliance on the Crown for financial assistance may cost us more than it's actually worth, Māori groups such as the Art Confederation are bound to be interested in looking elsewhere for funding to support our activities. The possibility of forming relationships with funders who are interested in what we are doing and who, crucially, are not the Crown is an exciting prospect. And on the other hand, Philanthropy New Zealand's most recent annual report suggests that now might very well be the perfect time for us to be contemplating forging relationships with philanthropic funders. It reveals that Philanthropy New Zealand's current strategic plan explicitly encourages its membership to support and, with Māori, grow Māori aspirations towards intergenerational giving. It tells us that in 2016, the organisation held its first treaty training workshop for funders. The chairperson records her pleasure at the progress being made with growing the organisation's knowledge and commitment to Te Ao Māori, which we would refer to loosely as the Māori world. Now, these are all encouraging signs of the sector's willingness to engage with us. Moreover, the initiatives that I mentioned earlier, Kohanga, Kura, Wānanga, so forth, these all show that Māori have a proven track record of designing and implementing innovative solutions to the problems that confront us. Solutions that have the potential to transform not just ourselves, but those around us as well. Who among us in Aotearoa would now argue that Aotearoa is not the richer for the revitalisation of language and culture that has swept through these islands over the past 40 years? So far, so good. Genuinely interested, well-intentioned funders on one side, and prospective fundees brimming with Indigenous creativity on the other. However, as with most things that may at first glance appear to be a panacea for our ills, a degree of caution is advisable. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that constructive relationships may not be formed or that important work cannot be done. Merely that reflecting on our own experience and also upon the experience of others may help us to avoid some potential pitfalls of proceeding down this path. I've recently been reading a book with which some of you may be familiar, and if you're not familiar with it, I would thoroughly recommend that you get a copy of it and read it. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It captures the experiences of a diverse range of social activists within America, people who work in movements that have become increasingly reliant on financial support within what the book refers to as the non-profit industrial complex. I should acknowledge at the outset that there are clearly some significant differences between the American context and our own. There is, of course, the matter of scale. While international figures suggest that New Zealand ranks highly in terms of philanthropy, the total amount given each year is a drop in the ocean compared with the mind-boggling sums that are given by a vast number of donors each year in the United States. And while I'm no expert in taxation law, the New Zealand statutory provisions with respect to taxing charitable donations are clearly quite different from those that apply in America, pursuant to the Internal Revenue Code. Despite these differences, reading this book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, raised some troubling questions for me about the relationship between movements for social change and foundation-based philanthropy. And I think that we would do well to ponder a few of these questions. So I'm just going to work through a few of the main concerns that some of these people raise in this book. A recurring theme that emerged from the accounts of funding recipients was that over time, being funded changed their organisations, and not for the better. Groups that had formerly relied on voluntary labour and on community-based fundraising found themselves becoming more and more preoccupied with securing the next round of funding. Time that once had been spent working in their communities to achieve social transformation was increasingly devoted to their communities, increasingly devoted to engaging in what one person described as the foundation dance. The foundation dance consists of writing letters of interest, proposals and reports, of massaging or changing one's goals to ensure consistency with funder guidelines, of adopting business practices to meet with funder approval, or internalising a corporate culture in order to fit with funder expectations. So there was a real concern about this, the distractions of the foundation dance and what happens to the reasons for which you were established in the first place while you are chasing after that next round of funding. A second concern that was raised by a number of people is the fact that fundee groups with similar goals found themselves in competition with one another in the race to attract funding. Not only did this reduce the prospect of forming alliances with like-minded people in order to promote wide-ranging social change, but it also discouraged fundee groups from admitting and therefore learning from their failures. Instead, they felt compelled to report on all projects as success stories. Indeed, some even found themselves being forced to repeat failed strategies because of the vehemence with which they had characterised them as successful in order to get further funding. A common reflection was that becoming reliant on foundation funding had compromised the radical edge of social activism, encouraging workers to think of activism as a career instead of as a calling, persuading them that nothing was possible without money, and limiting their vision to implementing small-scale projects as opposed to designing far-reaching strategies for the achievement of fundamental social change. Native American activist Madonna Thunderhawk, for example, noted that securing foundation funding by becoming a non-profit had initially seemed innocuous enough, just another way for Native activist groups to raise money. However, becoming part of the non-profit industrial complex changed the groups in ways that they had not anticipated. So this is a quote from Madonna Thunderhawk. She says, "The focus turned to raising money to keep the organisation going, while the actual work of activism became secondary and watered down. And when the money disappeared, the work did too. People work now for a salary rather than because they are passionate about an issue. People start seeing organising as a career rather than as involvement in a social movement that requires sacrifice." It was also suggested by some that foundation funding tended to favour projects that dealt with the results of social problems, rather than programs designed to prevent such problems from occurring. Paul Cavell, for example, lamented the way that men's groups established in the late 1970s to combat male violence had come to focus exclusively on dealing with individual perpetrators and survivors of violence at the expense of trying to end violence through community prevention and education. He delivered a particularly searing critique of the rise in social service provision over the promotion of social change. And he linked this development to the profound economic inequality within American society. He argued that the funding of social welfare initiatives were a cynical strategy, enabling the wealthy to maintain their position at the top of the economic pyramid by creating a crucial buffer between themselves and the vast majority of the population who are relegated to its lower levels. The spectre of philanthropic foundations actively working against radical social change, thereby protecting the privilege of the wealthy by entrenching inequality. This was a subject that was discussed repeatedly through this book. So too was the danger for fundee groups of becoming complicit in such entrenchment, despite their best intentions. And I have here a quote from Lethabo King and Osiandi, and I've just put this quote in because it typifies some of the sentiments that these people spoke about. I'll read it out as well. They say this: "Philanthropy is not progressive and never has been. Philanthropy never intends to fund revolutionary struggle that demands the just seizure of wealth, resources, and power that has been gained by exploiting the bodies, lives, and lands of people of colour worldwide. The time has come for social justice organisations to choose alternative means to fund their initiatives so that their agenda will be executed with integrity and so that they no longer risk colluding in the oppression of those they claim to represent." Now, far be it for me, particularly at an event such as this one, to suggest that philanthropic foundations are motivated entirely by self-interest, or that it is actually impossible for fundee groups to engage with these funders without selling out on the noble ideals which they claim to be pursuing. And indeed, a number of contributors to this book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, acknowledged that things were not black and white. They agreed that some foundations had shown a strong commitment to transformative action, and they provided examples of productive relationships having been established between social activists and philanthropists. Nevertheless, as we sit here in this conference contemplating our shared future as funders and as Indigenous peoples with lots of work to do, I think that there are some valuable lessons that can be taken, both from the American phenomenon of the non-profit industrial complex, but also from our own experience here with Whakatupuranga Ruamano. Remembering that Whakatupuranga Ruamano is a project that has transformed the lives of people and communities within this region. The following is a list of suggestions for consideration, both for Indigenous groups and for philanthropists. Firstly, a few considerations for Indigenous groups to bear in mind as we think about approaching philanthropic foundations for funding. Firstly, we must take the time to clarify our goals and to articulate the principles underpinning the way that we work towards their achievement. Whakatupuranga Ruamano, Generation 2000, had a goal of preparing the Art Confederation for the 21st century, and its 4 underpinning principles remain central to Te Wānanga o Raukawa's operations today. The Wānanga has also overlaid those principles with a set of 10 foundational kaupapa or values, which it seeks to express in all aspects of its work. And you may have noticed throughout this conference a number of the workers have been wearing t-shirts and looks like just a whole lot of words on the front. Those are our 10 kaupapa, our founding principles. So we wear them, we seek to express them. They're depicted on the walls, outside walls of this building. They're depicted on the gate. They're depicted in the carving across some of the work that's done over the road. So the kaupapa, they're everywhere in this institution. And I know that lots of institutions have underpinning values or goals or whatever, but I'm telling you, if it doesn't pass the kaupapa test here, it doesn't run. It's that simple. So principles and goals are really very important. Taking the time to establish clear goals and principles helps us to remain on track, ensures accountability to founding ideals, and can really help to prevent us from becoming distracted from our course by short-term imperatives. A second point to bear in mind, self-reliance is the key to independence of thought and action. External funding can play an important role in achieving specific goals, but the more reliant a movement becomes on external funding, the more vulnerable it becomes to external interference, or even to dissolution in the event that the funding is withdrawn. So it's crucial as Indigenous peoples to spread the risk by exploring as many avenues as possible for supporting our activities. Self-generated funding, community fundraising, voluntary contributions, so on. Business opportunities, there may be a range of ways that we can fund ourselves. I told you earlier about the Waitangi Tribunal claim that we brought in 1999 about the capital establishment funding. At that time, the Waitangi Tribunal noted that the Wānanga was this particular Wānanga was relatively stable and had been going for quite a long time. And the Tribunal noted that the reason for that was the enormous contribution of volunteers. That is what made this institution, in fact, it remains what has made this institution what it is today. People who didn't actually say, no money, can't do. People who just said, this is important, we'll do it. So we need to not become completely reliant on funding. And if we do decide to engage in the foundation dance, let us be clear about the purpose for doing so. Let the dance be for that purpose only. Let's not allow the dance come to define our very existence. Thirdly, Madonna Thunderhawk tells us that activism is tough. It's not for people interested in building a career. If we become comfortable doing the foundation dance, building careers around securing the next round of funding as opposed to working for change, that's probably a sign that we have lost our critical edge. Fourthly, 1, 2, 3, 4. Fifthly, I'm losing track of my numbers here, excuse me. Being an Indigenous person in a settler colony, by definition, means being confronted by an endless succession of daily crises: housing, education, health, employment, land, language, all the issues that have been talked about over the past 2 days. While we will inevitably feel compelled to respond to the situations that demand our attention from day to day, we cannot afford to remain permanently in reactive mode. It's essential that we make time to think, to plan, to imagine a different future. It's important that we do this collectively in places like this, generating ideas, sharing our dreams, and expanding our expectations about what is possible. Our work must not be limited to dealing with immediate problems via one short-term project after another. It must incorporate longer-term strategies that have the effect of changing our perceptions and educating others. In 1975, when Whakatupuranga Ruamano began, many of our own people believed the Māori language to be worthless. Now, while the language is still far from secure, there has been a clearly discernible shift in the way that we perceive its value. Along with other iwi initiatives, Whakatupuranga Ruamano has also contributed to a shift in non-Māori thinking about the value of the language. And finally, training our eye on the distant horizon is important. When Whakatupuranga Ruamano was first mooted, the year 2000 seemed a really long way off to some of us. It's already history. The architect of Whakatupuranga Ruamano, who was with us last night for dinner, is now counselling us to fix our gaze on the year 3000 if we are serious about our survival as a people. And he's not alone in making this suggestion. Meihana's father, Mason Dury, has urged us not to become the generation who, in 1,000 years' time, will be remembered as having been overwhelmed by matters of the moment. He has encouraged us to begin planning for tomorrow, not year by year, not decade by decade, but century by century, and with the year 3000 in mind. And now a few things for philanthropic groups who are interested in exploring relationships with Indigenous peoples, a few ideas for you to think about. Firstly, our experiences with the Crown have shown us that the line between being supported and being stifled can be a very fine one. While it's only fair to expect Indigenous recipients of funding to be transparent about what they do with the financial support that you provide, try to find a balance between the need for accountability and allowing them to get on with their work. Try to resist any urge you may feel to substitute your own goals for theirs, and be mindful of the need to avoid stifling their creativity by being too prescriptive. Secondly, rather than simply making project-specific grants with short-term outputs, contemplate funding long-term programs that contribute to public debate, generating ideas and promoting social transformation. Now, social transformation is not something that happens overnight. You have to take a long view in order to achieve it. Instead of approving projects that provide assistance to a select few underprivileged individuals or groups, thereby actually entrenching social stratification, consider resourcing the development of strategies that will ultimately redistribute the wealth and power of the community more equitably, so that economic and political disparity will actually become things of the past. Thirdly, there's no need to be defensive about your privilege, but it is important to accept that privilege brings with it responsibilities. Be willing to support work that may ultimately undermine your privilege in the interests of producing a better world for all. And finally, I am sure you are all well aware, you certainly would be after having sat through the last couple of days, I'm sure you're all well aware of the fact that Indigenous peoples such as ourselves have had political power wrested from us, have been rendered economically vulnerable, have been all but robbed of our Indigenous identity. We have had to claw our way back from the very brink of physical and cultural obliteration. It should come, therefore, as no surprise to you that our agenda is one of radical social change. Ultimately, we seek to disrupt the power of the states that have been superimposed upon the Indigenous map of the world, and to reassert control over our own lives. In terms of the colonial states within which we now find ourselves entrapped, we seek change that those states would define as revolutionary. And so, as you contemplate forming ongoing and meaningful relationships as philanthropic funders of Indigenous projects, I encourage you in the strongest possible terms to fund the revolution. So I'm going to wrap it up now. To conclude, I actually realise that to use a word like revolution is to risk upsetting people. At this moment, it's quite possible some of the funders in the room are wishing they had gone directly to Auckland instead of wasting their time coming to Otaki. And some of the Indigenous groups may be thinking, oh God, I wish she'd shut up, she's going to annoy them and frighten them away. But revolution is not a dirty word. It's not a dirty word, and revolutionaries do not need to be feared. What you have witnessed here in Otaki these past 2 days is a revolution in progress. Some of you will have met our aunties and uncles while you have been here. Auntie Margaret, would you mind standing up and waving at everybody? Please. Thank you. Now that, e hoama, that is what a revolutionary looks like. Auntie Margaret and that generation, they are the revolutionaries in whose footsteps my generation now tentatively walks. It is our privilege and our responsibility to do that walk as well as we possibly can. It is thanks to their vision, to their determination, that our little community has been transformed. A transformation that has rippled out through our region, a transformation that the Art Confederation will continue to work on for the foreseeable future. Now, I've focused on the Art Confederation because that's what I know. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we are unique in striving to change our circumstances. Indigenous communities all over the world are applying their creative genius in multiple ways to address the problem of survival. This activity is not optional for us. It's a matter of absolute necessity. For that reason, we will continue to do this work with or without support from non-Indigenous groups. But imagine how much more effective the work will be. Indeed, imagine how much better the world will be if we do this work together. Tēnā koutou.